Welcome to this Rails 8 video where we're going to implement federated login. Federated login is where we'll use a trusted service to provide our authentication for us. So this could be Google, Facebook, GitHub. It can also be a central authentication server if we're working for a big organization and we're creating an internal website for that organization. They might want us to use their central authentication server to log in. And what we'd get back is from one of these providers would be a unique ID that uniquely identifies the user. We can save that ID in the database. And when they go to log in again, we'll get that unique ID back and we can go look for the user with that ID. So we're going to use GitHub as our authentication provider. So what we want to do is log into GitHub. You want to go up to here to settings. And then from settings, you want to scroll down until you find developer settings. And then we got our OAuth apps, and that's what we're going to create. And we're going to create a new OAuth app. And you probably want to name it something to do with your application. So my application was to do auth. And then your homepage URL, you need to put something in here. You could put it as your homepage, but I'm just going to use my URL for my website. Now, if you can put whatever you want here, this one doesn't matter, but what does matter is this authorization callback. So my URL for my application is at todoauth.local. And if you notice, I have HTTPS. Now you might be visiting your website through localhost :3000. So this is what you want to use without the HTTPS. You just want to do HTTP. So most of you will want to use HTTP localhost :3000. But if you do have one of those URLs with OrbStack, then you'd want to use that instead, like I'm going to do. And then at the end, whether you have localhost :3000 here or this, you will want to put /auth/github/callback. So it's really important that we get this part right as well as our domain name. Go ahead and register that application when you got everything right. And now we have our client ID. So after we create the application, you'll notice you have a client ID and then a button that says generate a new client secret. So go ahead and generate that secret. And now you can copy your client ID and you can also copy your secret. Be really careful. This is the only time you're going to be able to see this secret. So if you don't copy it and paste it somewhere and you need to get it later, you'll have to delete the secret and create a new one. Now, we should not share our client ID or secret on the open internet. The ID is probably okay, but definitely the secret, we don't want to share it. But if we're going to put this directly in our code and we check our code into GitHub, we might accidentally share this with the open internet, which will definitely cause security problems. So what we're going to do is store it in a special area that Rails provides, which is this credentials file. And if you notice, it's encrypted. And it's encrypted with our master key that's right here. Now, the master key is not checked into GitHub by default. If you're using the git ignore file that got generated when you generated your app, this master key is not in there. Now, if you've had to create your environment, don't worry. When we go to add our credentials into this file here, it'll generate a new master key. But from now on, you want to save this file, maybe take a copy of it. It's just a string. You can open the file up and you can copy that string, email it to yourself, or put it somewhere where you'll have it, but not on the open internet. And then to edit our credentials file, we can't just edit it directly. If we click here, we'll just see a random string. So we're going to use Rails to edit it. And this is going to allow us to edit it in Visual Studio Code. So running this, you'll see that it will pause. And now we have this up here where we can edit. As soon as we edit and we save and we close this file, then it should continue on. It'll encrypt the contents and save it back into this file here. So we can go ahead and add GitHub and then add our client ID and our secret in this file. And once you've added them in, go ahead and save them. Now, I'm not going to show you what my client ID and secret is in this video, so I could keep my app secure. And you can see after I saved that file and then I closed it, that the file was encrypted. Next, we need to install our Omniauth gems that will allow us to talk to our service. And we're going to use the GitHub strategy. So This will install both Omniauth and the GitHub strategy. If you want to do login with Facebook or Google, you can look at Omniauth's website and there'll be another gem that you can include. And also we need to include this Rails cross-site request forgery protection. So you need to quit your server and run bundle to install those. Next, we need to create an initializer. Now, initializers run when we first run our server, and this initializer will set up our Omniauth gem. So in our config folder, we'll find an initializers folder. We just add a new file to that, and we call it omniauth.rb. Then we can add in this code that will initialize our GitHub strategy for Omniauth. If you notice, it takes a string here for our client ID and our secret. So if you ever need to debug with your credentials file, you could paste your ID and secret right in here. But just make sure you take them out and put them in your credentials file before you make any commits and push it up to GitHub. But I replaced those two strings with getting the information out from my credentials file. So you do rails.application.credentials, and then this GitHub is the same thing that we typed in our credential file. And the client ID and the secret also have to be spelled correctly. So go ahead and save that file. And once you have it saved, you can run bin/dev. And if everything went well, then your server will start up. So next, we need to add a button on our login page so users can click the button to log in with GitHub. So in my app views sessions folder on the new view, which is our login page, I just added this new button that says login with GitHub. And it needs to go to /auth/GitHub. And the reason why we have to use button to is that's going to make it a post request instead of a get request. So we can't use link to. And this just makes the button look like a button. And we also need to shut off turbo on this page or else it won't work. So we can see here we have our login with GitHub button, and we'll go ahead and click it. And you notice we're on our GitHub webpage, and it's asking if me as a user wants to authorize my app that I created. Now, usually the app's created by someone else, not by yourself. But since you're developing this app, this is what you will do. And you can see where it's going to redirect me to. So that's good. It's still my right URL. And I could say, yes, I want to authorize this. Now, if I don't want this website having my public data on GitHub, then I can cancel. But of course, now I won't be able to log in with GitHub. So as a user, I'm going to authorize this application. And now it's going to redirect me back to my Rails website. You notice I'm back on to do auth, and I'm actually on auth/github/callback. That's the URL we put in, which is exactly where we want to go. But right now, no route matches this. However, if you have enabled your debug console on this, then we can use this debug console to see what kind of information I was able to collect from GitHub. And all that information is stored in our request environment under the Omniauth auth hash. So we look at this and we can see that we have a lot of credentials here. And it's not that great of a view, but you could see that we got my name in here. And we also have what's a unique ID and also a token that allows me to act on behalf of this user that's trying to log in. So next, let's go ahead and create a controller that can respond to this callback request, and then it can look for the user in the database, and if it finds it, log it in. If we don't find a user, then we can create a new user and log that user in. So to create that controller, we'll use our generator. And I'm just going to create a controller called authentications. I'm not going to add any actions on this. Open up our config routes file. Now we can add the callback route and direct it to this new controller. Now we're going to have /auth/github/callback direct to the create action in our authentications controller. And this is if we're always going to use GitHub. Now we could have a multi-provider strategy. We can use GitHub and Google and Facebook. In that case, we'd want to replace this with provider, and then provider will be included in our params, and it will say, hey, this is someone from GitHub or this is someone from Facebook. So I'm going to go ahead and put in this variable. See the colon up here says this is a variable, and then I can do params :provider and get whatever's in the URL out. Now you can see in my authentications controller, this is apps controllers. In my authentication controller, I can go ahead and create a create method. And then I'm also going to get that hash that I showed you in the debug console out. And I just had created a private method so I could call it auth hash instead of this request.env. And we'll go ahead and look at this. We'll render and we'll put it into JSON mode and we'll render out that auth hash. Now going back into our login page, we'll try clicking this button again. And you could see we're back on our login path. Now this could be a really tricky bug, but if you remember the user authentication that we implemented before, make sure that we're logged in on any action that we call on any controller or any request, unless we specifically allow unauthenticated access. So we need to allow unauthenticated access to our create action so that we can call this method without being logged in. Now we try clicking the button again. And if you notice, we have our hash or our JSON with everything we have from the hash. Now, you also notice that you didn't see us go to GitHub. That's because A, I'm already logged into GitHub, and B, I've already authorized this application. So GitHub sees that, and instead of presenting anything to me, it just sends me right back to my application with all the information I need to be able to either create a user or log them in. Now, if you notice, that gave us more information that I want. So I'm going to boil that down into just the information I want. I'm going to call that the user hash. And I'm just going to get the unique ID that's provided by them. And also the provider. This will be GitHub since we're using GitHub. But if we have a multi-provider strategy like Google or Facebook, then we'd have that there. And then we also get their name and their email if they have them. And the credentials, this is the token that comes back. Now in this demo, I'm not going to use this token, but if in the future I want to act on behalf of this user, say create a repository for them or read a repository, I would need this token to do that. So now instead of rendering out the auth hash that has everything, we'll just look at the user hash. So trying this one more time. And now we just have my unique ID, my provider's GitHub, my name. If you notice I don't have an email, that's going to cause a problem in the future, and then the token to act on my behalf. So now instead of just printing out our JSON, we'll go ahead and try to either find the user in the database or create them if they don't exist. Now, just to leave this in, if we ever need to debug, I'm going to just leave this in our comments. And we can also put a return here. That way, if we want to debug, we can uncomment these two lines of code and we can see our hash again. So now we need a place in the database to store the unique ID that we're getting from GitHub. And we also might want to store the provider and the token. So I'm going to create a migration to do that. So I'm going to call my migration add authentication to user, and we want to add a unique ID, which is a string. And we don't want to make this required because we'll have lots of users who just use an email and a password to log in. This is only for users that log in through GitHub. And we also want to have a provider and a token. Now there's no reason to include the string because that's by default, it will be a string. And we'll go ahead and create that migration. And after we created it, we can run the migration with Rails DB migrate. And that should add all the columns onto our user to be able to store this user. So now that we have the columns there, we can go and edit our create method and see if there is a user in the database with the ID and the provider that we just got back from this hash. Now, just if we want our request to be a little more efficient, every time I use user hash, I'm actually calling this method and I'm rebuilding the hash. So let's do a little bit of caching so we don't rebuild the hash every time I say user hash. So we'll return the at hash if at hash exists, and if not, we'll build it and we'll take the hash and assign it to at hash. So the next time we call this, we won't have to rebuild it. Now, if we found a user in the database, then we just want to log that user in. And if we don't find a user in the database, then we want to create the user, save them in the database, and log them in. So going back to our user authentication, this is our sessions controller. You can see the way to log in a user is to start a new session for the user. So we'll start a new session for the user, but my users is called an @user. And thinking about it, there really is no reason to save this user later on because we're not going to use it in the view. So we could just call it user. And then we can redirect them to a root path with a notice saying you are logged in. Now here, if we didn't find the user in the database, that means we don't have any user with this unique ID from this provider. So let's go ahead and try to create a new user with them. So now I've gone into my models folder and into the user. And here I can add a method, and it's called self new user from hash, and we'll pass in this hash. We'll try to create a new user just using the mass assignment. But there's one more thing that we need to do, and we need to set the password digest to 0. If we try to save this user without a password, then we'll get some validation errors and it won't allow us to save the user. But we're trying to create a user without passwords. That's the full reason we're doing the federated login, is so that the user doesn't have to come up with a new password. So by setting the password digest to 0, that'll allow us to save the user in the database with an invalid password. There's no way somebody can try to come up with a password that will hash to 0. This doesn't even have the salt in it. And then at the end, we'll return the user. One little explanation here, the self dot, this makes the method a static method. Like if you remember in Java, you use public static void main, meaning that this is a class method, not an instance method. Now back in our authentications controller, if we didn't find a user, we'll try to create a new user from the hash, and we'll pass in the user hash. And then we'll try to save the user in the database. And if that is successful, we'll go ahead and log in the new user and redirect them to the root path. Instead of saying logged in, we can say you are signed up. Now the problem is some users might not have an email. They also might not have a name. And when we try to save a user without an email or a name, that's going to cause some validation errors. So if this doesn't work, then we need to save all this information we got from GitHub, and we can save that in the session. So saving the user hash in the session means that it will be stored in the session as the user visits more pages in the site. We'll be able to have access to this user hash. We're going to redirect them to the sign up path, and with a notice saying, please add the missing information. So now we're going to try this flow again. We're going to try to log them in with GitHub. And you can see I got an unknown attribute email for user, and that's because I created my user model with an email address. So this has to match the fields in my user. So we'll try that again. And this time we can see that we're getting this not null exception. That's because I have a constraint on my database, but it looks like I'm missing the validation. So you can see we're validating the name, but we're not validating the email address. So let's go ahead and validate our email address as well. And so now we're validating the presence of our email address. We'll go ahead and try to log in with GitHub again. And now you can see it says, please add the missing information, but there's no information here. So right now we're on the sign up page. So we're in our users controller under the new action. And what we want to do is check to see if we have that user hash saved in the session. And if there is a user hash in our session, then we'll create a user with that user hash. Now there's one more thing, is we want our validations to run so we can show the user what's missing, but we don't want to save this user in the database. So we'll just go at user.valid ? And that'll run the validations and add any errors onto this user model. Now, if there is no user in the session, or this user hash isn't stored in the session, then we'll just create a new user without any information. Just reminding you, if we're unable to save the user in the database, we save this user hash in the session. So when we get redirected back to our signup path, we'll find the user hash and be able to pull all the information we got from GitHub out and attach it to the user. So now we'll go ahead and log in with GitHub again. And now we could see, please add the missing information. And you notice the email address can't be blank. But the problem is we also have password fields on this form, and we don't want these password fields here if they're signing up through GitHub, because the full purpose is to not have a password. So we'll add another method into our model. This is our user in our models folder. Under our user, we'll add a has password method. And what this will do is it'll check to see if the password digest is nil. If the password digest is nil, that means that we're trying to create a user with a normal email and password. But if the password digest or if the password digest does not equal 0, remember 0 is what we set it when they sign up with GitHub, that also means they have a password. So if they have a password, we'll show the password fields on the form, and if they don't, then we won't show the fields. So going to our users view, this is the new view and in the form, and you might have put this in a partial, we can go ahead and use that password check. So if the user has a password, we'll show the fields, and if not, we won't. Now that user hash is already in the session, so we can just refresh. And now we see what will happen when they click login or sign up with GitHub. They'll go to GitHub, they'll authorize the app, and then they'll come to back to our app, and they'll see this sign up page that's saying, hey, the email can't be blank. And they'll also see that please add the missing information below. So we can go ahead and add an email onto this user. But before I save this user, we gotta work on our save method. And we save the user in our users controller under this create. Now, usually we create the user with the user params, but we also want to create the user with all the information from our hash so that we can, first of all, make sure the user doesn't need a password when we save it, and we can include any information that came from that hash. So we could see on this create method, if the user hash is still in our session, then we'll go ahead and create this user from a hash. Then from the user params, we'll go ahead and get their name and their email out and assign it to this user. Now, if you have other fields that you want to assign, this is where you would assign it from the parameters. And then if there is no user hash, we'll just create the new user just using the user params like before. And then if the user is able to get saved in the database, we'll log them in and tell them they're signed up. If not, we'll say redrop the form and have them fix the errors. Now there is one more thing. If we're able to save the user, we probably don't want to keep that session hash around. So we'll go ahead and erase that by setting it to nil. And if everything works okay, we'll click sign up. Now I got to remember that I'm calling this email address instead of just email. And we also want to update the params hash. And trying this again, we can see that they were able to get signed up. And now we have my name that comes from GitHub. The last thing we want to do is go ahead to our link that, or our button to be able to log in with GitHub. Let's go ahead and put it on our sign up path or our sign up page as well. At this time, maybe we'll say sign up with GitHub. And so now we can go log out. If we click sign up, we still have that sign up with GitHub button. It'll work the same way. Of course, if I click it now, it's just going to re-log me back in because it found me and it logged me back in. But what I can do to test the full flow again is go into the console and get my last user out. Now, usually user.last gets the user that was saved in the database last back out. And I can see that it is the one that has my UID and my provider. So I can say u.destroy to delete this user out of the database. So now we can try signing up this user again and logging them in. So we're on the sign up page. We can click the sign up with GitHub button and we can see if we want to authorize this. And if we did authorize it, we're back on the app. It says, please add the missing information. I could see that my email address is missing and I can sign up that user and now it says you are signed up. Now I can log out the user and now we could try logging in that user again and they're logged in. Now you still might want to check to make sure that you can sign up a person through the normal way without GitHub, but we still have one last problem. And let's go ahead and try to log in the user that I just created, missing@test.com, and we'll give in a password because maybe it's been a week or two or a month. They're coming back to our website, they're trying to sign up and they forgot that they signed up with GitHub. So when they try to click in, we're going to get this bcrypt error because our password hash is sitting at 0. And this isn't a very good response to the user. So going back to our sessions controller, this create action is our login action. And when we try to authenticate the user by their email address and they don't have a password, that's when it's going to throw the error. What we can do is we can rescue from the error. So this is kind of like a try catch in other languages. So we're trying this, and if we get a certain error back, and we're making sure it's the invalid hash error, then we can redirect them to the login path and tell them, did you sign up with GitHub? And that might jog their memory, and then they'll click the GitHub button. So now trying to log in missing at test.com with a password. They'll see, oh, yeah, I did sign up with GitHub. So now they can click the login with GitHub and log in properly. So now we have implemented federated login. If you want to implement login with Google or with Facebook or any other application, you can go to Omniauth's website. They have a bunch of strategies and a bunch of providers that you can use for your login strategies.